everybody. I'm just about to get started. So this is the monthly Public Invention Inventors Gathering. We try to meet every month. Public Invention is a U.S. 501c3 that could use your donations. Today's topic is going to be about how to fund open hardware, open source software, and open source science projects with an emphasis on projects before they have a large number of users and enough people to have a user base that other funding mechanisms become available. So the reason we're having this conversation in part is because Public Invention doesn't know how to fundraise effectively. And these monthly gatherings are not highly produced YouTube videos, although you may be seeing this on YouTube after the fact. We try to have a monthly conversation. We think people are looking for a live experience. So I was hoping to have a conversation about that. And we run a lot of projects, and fundamentally, we haven't cracked the nut on how to fundraise for them. But we have learned a few things, which I'm going to present in this talk before we have a conversation about it. Now, if you have an open source software project which has lots and lots of users, you have options. And there's a link here to something called Lemonade Stand at GitHub that has a pretty good description of the conventional way of doing this. And like a lot of things in our modern economy, if you have thousands and thousands of users, it's relatively easy to turn that into at least a small amount of money. But what if your project is, for example, a science project that not that many people are interested in, is highly specialized or just beginning, and every project begins usually with 0 users. So what we're talking about here is open source projects before they get large, open source hardware projects. And we refer to that essentially as engineering things that are not research things, but also open science projects, which include research things, which may be the kind of thing which Public Invention does, which is where we're trying to kind of build something useful, which is our approach. But it could also be exploratory science, studying insects or plants or everything. And Public Invention has only done a couple of those kinds of projects. So if you're starting a project, how do you raise money? Well, my beliefs are open source projects are awesome. It's hard to imagine a better return on investment for human society than funding open source software in particular. It's also the case that university research is not directly profitable in most cases, but we as a society have decided to fund universities to produce basic research. And universities are very good at it, and I'm a big fan of that, and I wish universities got more money. But amateur open source science projects, in some cases, are much, much cheaper than universities research, although they don't overlap and they can't do the same kind of thing. Universities can sometimes do more expensive projects than open science projects, but amateur open scientists can do a lot. Now, here's a miracle that I think everybody should understand. This is perhaps controversial. You can do a lot with almost no money. And my suggestion to anyone who's thinking, I would like to start a project, but I have no money, is just start it anyway. What money fundamentally does is it lets you go faster. It doesn't really prevent you from doing almost anything. Now, there are some projects that cannot be performed without money, but you can do an awful lot with less money than people think. But you can go faster if you're well funded. And whatever you're thinking about, I think your project deserves money. Why? Because open source projects are awesome. Almost every open source project deserves money, whether it's a nonprofit project or for-profit project. So let's talk about how you can get it. So this very shortly is my set of tips, and then I'm going to expand on these a little bit. Understand that money gives speed, not power. ask rich people for money. When I was a boy, uh, for the last 50 years of my life, for example, uh, it's been hard for me to ask people for money. I don't like doing it, but I've kind of gotten over it. And it's really the most effective way for small projects to raise money is just to go to where rich people are and ask them for money. In the case of nerdy things like open source software, that would be like tech meetups and business recruiting things and things like that. I'm also a big fan of applying for grants whenever you can because applying for grants has side effects. Now, Public Invention has applied for a lot of grants. I think we've probably applied for 10 in the last 10 years, and we've gotten three, maybe. Maybe we've applied for 12 or 15. I'm not sure. Your your chance of getting a grant is relatively low, but the side effects of applying for a grant are wonderful, which is people become aware of you. You practice your documentation and your motivation and your description of it. And usually what happens is you apply for a grant and you get better at applying for the next one. So even though your chance of winning a grant is extremely low, it's still worth the energy to apply for it. Now, unless you have superhuman character, you probably get too discouraged too easily. And that happens to me certainly. You know, you ask five people for money, they all say no, and you kind of get dejected. You're like, oh, it's no good. I'm not going to ask anybody for money. But the truth is, you shouldn't expect a plea for money to be successful with a very high probability. So you just have to do it a lot in a very polite way. And so, in that sense, you should use a trick that writers use, which is to view each rejection as a small success. Now, where do donations come from? Well, if we take a step back and we think about the larger picture, the donation of time is the largest donation by far to most open source projects. So, for example, of the um, 80 repositories that Public Invention has and the 14 active projects that we have, by far the largest contribution is the unpaid time of our volunteers, including my own, that work on those projects. Like the cash value of that time, would be measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we don't get that much. Um, uh, but that being said, private donors who are relatively wealthy are probably the best source of money for small projects. Okay. Now, there are a lot of foundations for which you can apply for money, but there are tremendous limitations to that process. And I speak from experience on this. There are databases of foundations that you can find. A lot of them you kind of have to pay for to use, but you can look through them, and what you will discover is that the major foundations that you have heard of, like the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, um, the Ford Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, etc. Those wonderful foundations don't let you apply. They're invitation only. They come to you, and their basic position is, don't send us anything. We have too many applicants. We'll come to you when we want something, which I think is very unfortunate. So I'd like to give kudos to the Sloan Foundation, which is the one foundation that will actually sort of respond to something without being invited. It's very kind of the Sloan Foundation to do that, and I wish more of them did, because even if they get 1,000 applicants, it's necessary in a democratic society that people be able to submit an application. Okay. But if you look at the second and third tier foundations, the ones that you haven't heard of, you will find that many of them are founded by wealthy people who want to solve a problem that they are familiar with. So, a multimillionaire in Poughkeepsie or Tulsa, Oklahoma, you know, dies, creates a foundation to solve a problem that affected them in some way. Breast cancer, Lyme disease, drug addiction, alcoholism, environmental concerns, whatever it may be. Obviously, those people were probably not thinking about your open source software project when they died. Therefore, most of these second tier foundations, their purpose is not to fund the kinds of things that the audience listening to this talk is interested in: open source hardware, open source software, open science. Okay. Now, some of these are application worthy, even though you aren't likely to get funded. It's still a good idea to send them if your project is even tangentially at least a little bit related to what they're interested in. I think it's valuable to send them an application. Okay. Now, when you apply for things, there's a big scale in terms of how hard it is. For example, in Texas, there's a famous family, the Moody family, that has the Moody Foundation. The Moody name can be found in Galveston, Houston, Austin. They fund a lot of things. It's very easy to apply for a Moody grant. It's like three paragraphs. I have never won a Moody grant, but I appreciate that it's easy to apply. The opposite of that is the federal government. I'm happy to say that Public Invention recently won a National Science Foundation grant. And one thing you have to understand about those kinds of grants is that they require an enormous amount of paperwork. Okay. Now, this is a trade-off, and it's a good trade-off. The US federal government doesn't want to waste money. I know there are a lot of people who won't believe that, but they really strongly try to prevent fraud, abuse, and waste. And the basic way they do that is they make you give them an enormous amount of information about what you're doing so that they can properly vet it. Now, to the average person creating a GitHub repo, creating an open source software project that has no money, maybe one partner, on their project, applying for a grant to the federal government may seem completely impossible, but it isn't. The federal government very, very, very rarely funds science projects run by individuals. And more commonly, if you're a for-profit business, you can apply for a small business innovation research grant. And quite a few of those are provided if you're for-profit. Sadly, in my opinion, the US government does not fund nonprofit things the way they fund the so-called SBIR, or small business innovation research grants. Now, one thing I'd like to encourage people to do is to kind of up their game and try to become the adult in the room, which is probably not a very useful phrase, but Public Invention has gotten a lot of benefits from doing these various things. So I recommend everybody have a proper bookkeeping system. Okay, now you can start small. An Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheet spreadsheet is all you need to begin with. Okay, if Uncle Bob gives you $50, put it in the spreadsheet. If you spend $100 on Amazon Web Service hosting fees, put it in the spreadsheet. That's better than nothing. As you mature, you can get better at your bookkeeping. At some point, you're going to want to have a proper board of directors. And that's true if you're a for-profit firm or if you're a nonprofit, as Public Invention is. And then far too few people do not consider actually applying to the US IRS to become a US 501c3 public charity. Now, it is a sort of daunting amount of paperwork that you have to read, but anybody can do it. Now, we did pay a lawyer when we applied to become a US 501c3 back in 2018, but you don't actually have to do that. And it's not terribly expensive. We paid $2,000, and that's probably low, but that's sort of a reasonable price to do this. Now, why would you even consider this? If you're a nonprofit, It makes it possible for other people to give money to you in a tax deductible way. And of course, obviously, that has an economic benefit to potential donors. So, like, if I've got organization A that's not a US 501c3 and organization B that is, if I give it to B, I pay less in taxes that year because I can write off my donation. Okay. Also, many foundations will not give money to either a small firm or an individual. They will only give money to other 501c3s. So, how to start small and grow, because that's what we're talking about. Every project starts as just a gleam in somebody's eye, right? Before they have partners, before they have teammates, before they have a GitHub repository, before they have a business registered, before they have 501c3 status. What do you do? Start your accounting system. Start with a spreadsheet. Eventually graduate to a bookkeeping system like QuickBooks, or there are other open source bookkeeping systems you can use. We use QuickBooks. You may eventually have to start paying for it, but you don't have to do that originally. You can just use a free system. Organizationally, I encourage people to become a real business entity, whether you want to be a for-profit or a nonprofit business entity. Now, in the United States, this is very, very, very easy compared to in other countries. In the state of Texas, it's extremely easy. In other states, it may be harder, but even in other states, just becoming a business is not that hard. Um, and so I recommend that people just read about it and learn how to do it. In most cases, you're going to want to have a board of directors. Now, a board of directors goes a long way towards making you the adult in the room, and it serves several purposes. It keeps you sane. That is, for example, the Public Invention Board of Directors um, sometimes says no to requests that I make. Right? They don't just rubber stamp everything that I do, and it's nice to have the moral support of people behind you, but also people who are empowered to say, "Wait a second, that may not be the best idea." Okay. A board of directors also provides continuity and longevity. Okay. So I'm sad to say, in my case, that might be actual longevity in the sense that I may die. But for most projects, that just means the founder can get tired of it or get a job or get married or have a kid or whatever and no longer be able to work on the project. And the project can still continue because the board of directors is a fallback that doesn't require the founder to be there. Okay. And then finally, having a board of directors is valuable for most funding. If you're a nonprofit, you can obtain a fiscal sponsor. Now, the rules around this are a little complicated, but it gives you some of the benefits of being a 501c3, like tax deductible donations earmarked for you without becoming a 501c3 yourself. So it's a good prelude to becoming a 501c3. Okay. Usually the fiscal sponsor takes between 10 and 15% of every deduction as kind of an administrative fee. But that's kind of reasonable. Public Invention has done that in the past. We're not acting as a fiscal sponsor for anyone right now, but it's a reasonable thing to do. And if you want to apply for 501c3 status, you don't have to have a lawyer. You just have to do a lot of reading. But a lawyer may help you avoid some pitfalls due to the kind of specialized jargon that the U.S. federal government uses. If you're a for-profit, I want you to remember this rule. It's very important. And I've seen this happen with very intelligent, responsible people. I've seen this be a problem. This is something that should be taught to everyone. Let's say that Joe, who's here in the audience with me, and we decide to create a for-profit business tonight. And, Joe comes to me and says, I have an idea. And I say, Joe, I think that's a good idea. I'll join your company if you'll give me 30% of your company. So when we make $1 million, you'll take 700,000, I'll take 300,000. Write that down. That is what's called a cap table or a capitalization table. And it basically defines who owns what. Because a year from now, after Joe and I have both worked very hard for a long time, the details of what we said when Joe proposed that may be lost in the haze of memory, or may have been lost when someone else came on the team. And so it's very, very important that you write down, and you don't have to do anything but use a spreadsheet. You have to be perfectly clear about who owns what within your business. Now, if you are creating a for-profit startup, there are lots of books on that, including funding. And so I'm not going to go into it. I'm not an expert. I know a little bit about it, but I have nothing to add compared to the books that you could read on that subject. But this maxim is not discussed in all of those books, and I really think it's important. So fundraising events barely raise money, but they have lots of benefits. Now, I was told by a fundraiser for Engineers Without Borders, which is a very, very large US nonprofit, way larger than Public Invention. There are 300 chapters of Engineers Without Borders USA spread throughout the country. And each one of them probably has 30 volunteers, and they run, about 100 projects every year, providing wonderful services to communities all over the world. That the average fundraising event, the expected amount of money you're going to make is $0. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Of course, you'll bring some money in with your fundraiser, but usually the amount of money you bring in is pretty much what you spend on food or wine or the band or whatever it is you're doing as a draw to bring stuff in. Sometimes you'll make more, sometimes you'll make less. Public Invention has run a number of fundraisers. Usually we lose money. Occasionally we make a small amount of money. This has been approximately true for us. So you might say, well, why would you ever hold a fundraiser if the expected amount of money you're going to make is $0? Because having fundraisers have a lot of other events, a lot of other benefits. And that is, these events increase the public's awareness of you, and they also bring people together and are fun. So fundraising events are useful, just don't expect them to make a lot of money. Now, crowdfunding is a wonderful idea. We've done it once and we raised about $1,000. We don't know how to do it very well. I'm not an expert on this. It seems like it should work. I believe it's relatively difficult. It requires really good kind of marketing skills and communication skills. I think everyone should consider it. You'll have to look elsewhere for advice on how to do it properly. There are a lot of things I don't understand about raising money. For example, we have some sponsor buttons on our GitHub repos. We've never really made any money from that. We get some donations through our websites from people that we've never heard of before, but not very much, less than $1,000 a year. Like many nerds, my goal is not really to raise money. I think I could probably do it by putting in a lot of hours working on it, but I'd rather be working on the science projects or the hardware projects or something. And so it's not really my preference. And, the people I'm speaking to in this audience probably feel the same way, right? And so I don't know how to solve that problem except to convince people who are good at marketing and fundraising to join your project in some way or another. And Public Invention has been lucky and has had that to some extent. And now, finally, I want to say that there is enormous wealth in our country. It's really kind of mind-boggling. And open source software is almost unfunded, really, compared to other items. And open source software and open source hardware and open science are really very poorly understood. So of all the money spent on food banks and drug rehab centers and cleaning up parks and making trails, all of which are very valuable services, that money dwarfs the money going to open source software. And I think the return to society on open source software, hardware, and science is actually quite great. It's just a problem of people not understanding it. So I'd like to end my part of the talk now by presenting these topics for discussion. Does anyone want to create a foundation with me to microfund open source projects? Does anyone know of a reliable way for an open source project to raise $1,000? Is there a way we could change the game for all the projects that are out there? How could open source projects get 1/1000th of the money spent on drug rehabilitation, food banks for the homeless? And should they? I think they should. I think open source projects should get 1/1000th of the money spent on homelessness, but someone might disagree with that. How can we show that open source software, hardware, and science empowers everybody? Obviously, many people are not able to take advantage of open source software in the sense that they're not technical themselves. They don't know how to use open source software. Nonetheless, they benefit from it, even if they don't know it. And how can we show that to people? And then finally, in strictly economic terms, like the study of formal economics you take in an economic class, open source software has a tremendous economic surplus. And the amount of money donated to funding these things is tiny compared to the economic surplus that it provides, and yet none of it goes to really to open source software. And so that ends my talk. And now I'd like to open it up to the small number of people here in the audience.
Man, I think I agree that we should have the ability to fund systems and research. What is the right way to decide that something is worthy of being funded? But um, it's the type of thing that how do you sell it and convince people that it's worthwhile? I think it's pretty easy to, well, maybe not super easy, but it's pretty straightforward to say it's worthwhile to get people off the street. Um, how do you say it's worthwhile to come up with some random invention that will probably be useful to someone someday, but not directly connected to the public good? So how do you justify it? I don't know. That's a great question.
Well, that's right. And of course, for some software projects, it's even more abstract than the inventions that Public Invention works on. Like you're making some library for uh, a computer language that no one has heard of, or yet another Python library for matrix multiplication. It's understandably quite hard to tie that to the benefit to any human beings. Nonetheless, those things can end up being used by thousands and thousands and thousands of people, but they have to start somewhere. The famous Log4j project is an example of something that was used by an enormous number of people and had some kind of a security hole in it, I think. And when the guy who maintained it, quit maintaining it, it created a tremendous problem, demonstrating that there was a tremendous economic surplus, which he was not getting paid for to do. And that's true of many projects. Now, some of those projects, they do obviously have a large user base, and that's a slightly different problem for our society to fund than projects which are just starting out. Okay, and I would like both of them to be funded, and it's the job of people. Sadly, I'm tempted to say it's my job, although I don't feel adequate to it. It's the job of people like me to convince society that it's a good use of our money to, um, give, $1,000 to three people who don't own a shirt with a collar, to write some software project to make better rounded corners in OpenSCAD, right? Nonetheless, I believe that is true.
So this is interesting because one of the issues or one of the projects that we're working on is the biochar project, which I firmly believe has a commercial application. It is a fully open source project, and one of the issues I've been struggling with is how to find funding for that project after we've done the hard work of proving that the core concept is useful to the general public. But after the point in time when you've disclosed most of your intellectual property, and it'll be very difficult to get investment on top of that. I've recently been looking at NSF grants or maybe government funding to bridge that gap, because one of the problems with that particular project, because it is a true hardware project where the materials and capabilities needed to make it cheap and affordable, it's going to require a level of scale and capital investment that is not trivial for most projects. So it's kind of top of mind right now, at least, and I don't exactly have a good solution for it. Part of it, I think, is maybe accepting that it may never be easy to fund, but and the actual commercial applications to it may be a drop in the bucket for the humanitarian impact that it eventually has. So, but I think that I do think that for a lot of these projects, you have to solve both problems to make them sustainable, for people to make it worthwhile for people to put effort into them. Because for example, one project I worked on was a infrared camera project. It's fully open source. It was a plastic scanner. And that project was interesting because the moment it became from a proof of concept to a viable product, the entire project died. And everyone who's working on it kind of shuffled off into the corners. And now there's, I think, 3 or 4 different companies that have very oddly similar technology approaches to the same idea. And that's another one of those projects where it's very much a labor-intensive work to get the core concept idea out there, but it's also labor-intensive to get the customized IR emitter receiver chips that are co-packaged and cost-effective enough to be able to put into a product like that. So I don't really know what the answer is, because the worst thing that's going to happen, I think, in a lot of these cases, is that all this open source effort can then become closed source again. Although there is at least a proof of concept that people can go back to and build from first principles to recover the open source project as is. So.
Yes. Well, so let me just be precise, because open source projects never become closed source. What happens is people work on an open source project, and then either the people working on it or someone else, start developing things in a closed source way. But the open source things which has been released, it cannot be retracted. It's a contribution to the world in any case. Although in practice, putting a file on the internet may not be enough. A lot of times the knowledge is embedded in human beings. And so human beings may do a bunch of research, put it on the web at a GitHub repository, but that's not enough to create a business. And they take the knowledge that's in their head and they create a business, and they quit contributing to an open source project. That does happen, and it's very unfortunate. Okay. But one thing we're talking about here is just beating a dead horse, right? Like, who pays for research, right? Research is a capitalization cost. You for any business, you have to sort of pay that cost. Now, in America, the federal government funds universities, and businesses for free sometimes use whatever the universities have produced, and then go on to make lots of money based on technology which was funded by the U.S. federal government. Sometimes the universities try to collect a royalty, but sometimes they don't, and it gets complicated. And you're asking exactly the same question, right? Like it's going to cost a modest amount of money to do the research to build a biochar toilet that's effective, right? And then, of course, scaling it up is going to be another big chunk of money. But it would be nice if the money that will eventually be made from that could be used to fund the research. We have no good mechanism for doing that at the moment. Okay. And, startups do this, but when they do it, they tend to close the technology and keep it secret because they don't want people to compete with them. That's one way of doing business. I'm not necessarily opposed to that existing as a mode of doing business, but another mode is to say, no, we as a society will go faster if we do the research in an open way so that everyone can benefit from it. And it would be nice if we had a mechanism to do that. Okay. But in a much more boots on the ground thing, there are projects out there that deserve to be funded that are never going to be as big as, let's say the biochar project, which is, risky, but obviously everyone uses the bathroom, right? So the market on that eventually is very large. But there are other projects that are much, much, much smaller that still deserve a small amount of funding. And what I've tried to talk about is how those people can get that funding. And I have not given a good answer. I don't know. There is no good answer today. I've given some answers, but I don't believe I've told people how to do it. And I'm sorry, we just don't know how to do it.
I will say that I got a chance to watch the OSHWA talk today as well. They had two open source medical devices that both came out of academia / industry and decided to both take the plunge to be open source, primarily to basically grow their community engagement. I think it's interesting because I think from a traditional science standpoint, sometimes the hardest thing you can do is to get somebody to care about your niche project. And one of the nice things about open source is that allows you to openly talk about and develop a community, and more importantly, allow people to find products and solutions and ideas that may not ever have come up in your field or in your day-to-day life, or maybe something that you didn't really see an application for. So it lets in a way, the market or the collective kind of like tackle the problem of what's it good for. And that's what I think was kind of exciting is that that both of these companies had like technologies that I think they had a good biomedical use for. But I could see some applications in everything from manufacturing to like inspection to like non-invasive like haptic devices. So I think it's one of those things where it's like the more you share, the more you get an exponential growth in opportunity and possibilities. And I think some people recognize that, especially when they're coming from fields where they're traditionally very locked down.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, that's part of the appeal of all open source development. For example, there's a lot of open source science. Like famously, people make fun of open source science that's specified around one species. Like, we counted how many sightings of nightjars there were in Texas in the month of April, right? And someone can say, we've got wars and famines and everything. Why do we care about how many nightjars are flying around in Texas, right? It's an easy thing to ridicule. But, I think there are good reasons to care about those kinds of things. And some people, whether you agree with me or not, some people really care about nightjars. I happen to find them fascinating, beautiful birds. And so it is difficult to tie this knot and say, well, why should this be funded in any way? And you know, I mean, at one level, I would say go to parties where rich people are and ask them for money. Okay. Now, maybe you say, I don't know how to get invited to a party where any rich people are. Go to a tech meetup about Python, and those people are probably not the richest people in the world, but they probably have jobs, you know. So, I mean, you know, if you're looking for, you know, $1,000 for your project to pay for your AWS server, or you know, for yourself, or to pay an artist, or to pay a lawyer for you to get incorporated, or to pay a lawyer for you to get your 501c3 status, you know, you might be able to raise it that way.
But you also want to make sure you don't end up on Jeffrey Epstein's island just to get $1,000 for your AWS. It's probably going to
Yeah.
backfire.
So
Yes. I mean, you need to have integrity, you know, for what you do to get the money, right? Especially, see, when you start out, you're probably not a 501c3. So you don't, there's no, about like, public invention is a 501c3. So we have to file taxes that say every year where we got our money, how much money we have. You know, it provides the public some assurance that, for example, the board is not taking the money and it's not being spent on lavish vacations, right? Okay. If you're much smaller and you're not a 501c3, there is no such safeguard. And it's your responsibility when you say, I want $1,000 to buy graphic art for our project, and to pay my AWS server fee, and to buy a new computer because mine is too old to run the computational fluid dynamics, that you tell the truth. Right. And I think most people do, and most people have an easy story to tell. The problem is the story is only something that a small number of other people in the world want to hear.
one thing I'd also say is that during COVID, we had a I think I forget I'm blanking on the name right now, but they had basically like fiscal sponsorship that made it easy for projects, open source projects, or projects in general.
Open Collective was one famous one.
That's what it was. They famously had to shut down because of the legal fees that they incurred. And I know that Public Invention works as a fiscal sponsor for its own projects. I think one of the big takeaways I've found is that it's easier to ask for money if there's an easy way for somebody to give you money. And that could be in form of like a place to put a check, which means a banking account, which means incorporation, which means some level of 501c3 and all that.
Right.
Or having a fiscal sponsor to handle money in your stead.
Right.
I think in a lot of, like, for example, like when I'm about to go into a publication or a promotional phase for the biochar project, I've got like 2 or 3 different places I'm planning on presenting it. I need to probably also like brush up on how people can donate to the project and make a sizable impact, both to the work that we're doing through that, as well as things that they may be interested in pursuing, or either participating in directly or funding indirectly.
Well,
that
so
reminds me
look,
of that.
I mean, the biochar project is a project supported by Public Invention. So I wouldn't say it's fiscally sponsored, because that has certain legal separations which are not necessarily public. The biochar project is just a Public Invention project. Public Invention is a 501c3. Abstractly, for any of our projects, anyone can give money to Public Invention tax-free, and they can earmark it for one of those projects. Okay. Now, fiscal sponsorship is just a little bit different, because it means an outside organization is being treated as if it's within the umbrella of the mission of Public Invention. And we have done that in the past. We're not doing it right now for somebody. And when a 501c3 becomes a fiscal sponsor, they have a paperwork burden to make sure that whatever they're paying for is aligned with the mission for which the IRS gave them the tax deductible status in the first place. And you've got quite a bit of actual accounting that you have to do. Like you have to keep track of the receipts that are spent. You can't just take the money and give it to another organization. So it's actually kind of painful to be a fiscal sponsor. Okay. Nonetheless, it's valuable for organizations that are 501c3 to act as fiscal sponsors for the reasons that Lauren just said. You don't have to have your own bank account. You don't have to have your own 501c3 status. You don't have to have your own bookkeeping system. Those things are provided by the umbrella organization. And the social contract is the umbrella organization releases the money only when they know it's going to be well spent and keeps its promise to the IRS that the money is going to serve a social purpose for which it's been given tax deductible status.
I just reminded me that like it's valuable to have that as part of your pitch, so people know what they're what they're sponsoring, how they can donate, and how they can help. So I think it's just a good reminder. Like it's not only just asking for money; it's also making it easy for people to give you money. So,
right. Okay. Well, if there are no further questions, we can think about ending this. I'd like to remind everybody that, as we've been talking, Public Invention is a 501c3. We sometimes, Public Invention is devoted to the public good. We sometimes talk about open source as if it means nonprofit. That it is not true. Okay, there are lots of open source projects which make a lot of money for a lot of people. Okay, the Linux GNU system being one example of that, but there are lots of other examples. But what this talk has focused on is the kinds of projects before you have enough users that you can get money, for example, selling customizations or selling technical support or doing other things for your software, right? I mean, that's a viable way for open source software to make money if it has a reasonably large user base. It's very hard to do that at the beginning of a project. Okay. All right. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I know if you listen to this on YouTube, it's not as polished as some of the wonderful videos of people where it's a scripted, performance and all, but we're trying to make a live experience for people to talk about invention in the public good, which is the purpose of Public Invention. We meet every third Thursday of the month you can find us at Eventbrite and come to the Zoom meeting, and we'd love to have you in future months. And if anyone who has some spare cash is listening to this, we have 14 active projects at Public Invention that could use your donations. So thank you very much, and I'll stop recording.